You read in the newspaper about interest rates going up and down, and you might ask, what causes that? What changes in the economic environment show up as increasing interest rates or falling interest rates, and what does that mean? Interest rates represent the price of money, and therefore are determined in the market for money. We've discussed how the demand for money is related to the interest rate. That is, how people's decision to hold cash and checking, as opposed to bonds and stocks, is influenced by changes in the interest rate. Now we're going to add the supply of money to calculate supply and demand's interaction to determine the equilibrium interest rate. But first, remember that as the interest rate falls, people choose to hold more of their wealth in the form of cash, that is, money. And lower interest rates, because they represent a smaller opportunity cost of holding cash, make it profitable for people to opt for the convenience of money instead of the return on interest-bearing assets. The downward sloping demand curve represents the movement into money as interest rates fall. What does the supply curve look like in this market? The money supply is controlled by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve determines the amount of money that's appropriate for there to be in the economy in order to make sure there's enough money to make business easy to do, but not so much that prices begin to rise, sparking inflation. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply using a variety of tools that we'll be discussing later. But right now, let's just imagine that the money supply is fixed. That is, the Federal Reserve has sufficient power to make the money supply whatever it wants it to be. In particular, the money supply does not respond to changes in the market interest rate. The money supply may influence the interest rate, but it is not influenced by it. Therefore, we can treat the money supply as fixed. It is a policy variable that the Federal Reserve controls. Because the money supply does not depend on the interest rate, when we draw it in this diagram, it shows up as a vertical line. Whatever the interest rate is, the Federal Reserve gets to choose the money supply that it wants. Now, I can label this vertical curve MS, representing the money supply. Now that I've got a money supply and a money demand curve, I'm ready to move on to the calculation of equilibrium. So, equilibrium, as usual in a supply and demand diagram, occurs where the demand and supply curves touch each other. That is, this point right here, where the curves cross, is going to be the point of market clearing, equilibrium interest rate, I star. In order to see this clearly, let's imagine that we're at some interest rate that's not market clearing, an interest rate where the supply and demand curves are at different places. If we're at an interest rate like I sub 0, an interest rate that's above equilibrium, then the quantity of money demanded at that interest rate is going to be less than the quantity of money supplied. That is, we have an excess supply of money. The Federal Reserve has made available to the market more money than people want to hold at that higher interest rate. So what are people going to do? What they're going to do is they're going to take all of this extra money and show up at their bank, and they're going to want to put it into their savings account. Banks find then that they're overrun, they've got this glut of deposits, and therefore savings account rates begin to drop. The interest rate the bank will pay you becomes less because the bank doesn't need any extra money. As the interest rate begins to fall then, people say, well, I don't want to put my money in savings, I want to hold it in my wallet to do shopping with instead, because the interest rate is less, therefore the opportunity cost of holding that convenient transactable form is less. So that will resolve this excess supply. As the interest rate falls, then people demand a larger quantity of money, and eventually, as the interest rate gets to I star, the market is going to clear. Now, another way of telling the same story is whenever people say, I've got too much cash at the going interest rate, they go and they buy bonds with it. When everybody wants to buy bonds, they're bidding up the price of bonds. And as the price of bonds gets higher and higher and higher, the rate of return on bonds gets smaller. That is, if this bond pays you $10 a year and you can buy it for $100, that's a 10% rate of return. But if you have to pay $200 for the same bond, that's only a 5% rate of return. So as the price of bonds rises, as people aggressively compete for bonds, trying to get rid of their extra cash, they drive up the price of bonds, and that's the same thing as driving down the rate of return, or the interest rate. As that interest rate falls, people then decide that they'd rather hold cash instead. Consider the other possibility, that the interest rate is below equilibrium. If the interest rate is below equilibrium, say at some level like I1, then the quantity of money demanded on the demand curve is greater than the quantity supplied. That is, we have an excess demand for money. People say, hey, interest rate's so low, why shouldn't I carry cash? It's not worth the hassle to deal with the bank account. The return isn't high enough. So what happens in that case is everybody goes to their savings account and wants to withdraw cash from it so they can carry the money around. Banks then are running short on savings. They don't have enough money in their banks to make their loans. And in order to attract savings, banks begin to aggressively compete, raising the interest rate on savings accounts. And as they do so, people decide, oh, banks look attractive again, and they come back to put their cash in. See, the point here is that as banks bid up the interest rate, people decide that they would like to economize on their cash holdings to take advantage of these rising rates. And the quantity of money demanded declines until the equilibrium is reestablished at I star. Alternatively, people down here say, the interest rate is so low, who wants to hold a bond? Everybody decides to sell their bond. And when everyone sells their bonds, the price of bonds is pushed down. When the price of bonds is pushed down, the rate of return on bonds is pushed up. Remember that bond that pays you $10 a year? Well, at $100 for the bond, that's a 10% rate of return. But if bonds lose value, that is, if their price drops to $50, now that's a 20% rate of return when you get that $10 check annually. So whenever bond prices are falling because people are trying to get rid of their bonds and get cash instead, the interest rate on bonds, the rate of return is bid up until finally people decide, yes, they're just as happy holding these bonds because the interest rate is back at a level that gives us equilibrium. So what happens then in this market when something changes? We've looked at supply and demand and equilibrium. Our last challenge is to do some comparative statics exercises. That is, what happens when the curves shift? Well, let's think about a few things that would shift the curves. First of all, what would shift the demand curve for money? Well, if the price level were to increase, everyone would need to hold more cash to do their shopping. Therefore, the demand curve for money would shift outwards. With the demand curve for money shifting outwards to a new level, the old interest rate, I star, would create a situation in which we have excess demand for money. At this old interest rate now, there's a larger quantity of money demanded than there is supplied. So that creates a bidding process. Banks start to compete to hold on to their savings accounts, and the interest rate rises to restore equilibrium. If the price level increases, then equilibrium interest rate rises. The same thing is going to be true if real output increases. If real output increases, the demand for money increases across the economy. People need more cash and checking accounts to do their business, and everyone shows up at once wanting to sell their bonds and get cash instead. When everybody tries to sell their bonds, once again, interest rates are going to be bid up. The same thing if everyone tried to withdraw from their savings account at once. Banks would find themselves scrambling to hold on to their deposits. Interest rates would be bid up, and a new higher equilibrium interest rate would be established. So as far as the demand curve is concerned, a higher price level or a higher real gross domestic product will increase the demand for money, and either of these developments will push up the equilibrium interest rate. The final thing that we could do is we could shift the money supply curve. If the Federal Reserve decided to increase the supply of money, we'd get a new supply curve, maybe out at a point like this. And if the Federal Reserve were to increase the money supply to a new higher level, then at the old interest rate I star, look, we've got a much bigger supply of money than we have demand for money on the original red curve. Well, people have now got more money than they want, and what are they going to do with it? They're going to show up at the bank and want to deposit it, and when everybody deposits at once, the bank finds itself glutted with savings deposits, and that pushes the equilibrium interest rate down. An increase in the money supply creates excess supply of money at the original interest rate, and people's behavior at that point is going to be to go out and seek interest-bearing assets because they don't want any more cash. When everyone does that, the price of bonds is going to be bid up, pushing down the rate of return, and banks are going to find themselves glutted with savings deposits, so they'll lower their interest rates. Therefore, an increase in the money supply leads to a lower equilibrium interest rate. Whatever direction the money supply changes, the equilibrium interest rate changes in the opposite direction. So now you can do your own experiments. There are really three variables that can change in the story: the price level, real gross domestic product, and the nominal money supply controlled by the Fed. Anytime one of those variables changes, you'll get a change in the equilibrium interest rate through an interaction of money supply and money demand.